Good morning, my name's Alan Mayer. I'm a retired Anglican priest and I'm leading us through 365 Bible studies, one for every day of the year. At the moment we're looking at the period in Old Testament history between the exile in Babylon and the return and rebuilding of Jerusalem. At the moment we're looking at the work of Ezra and Nehemiah just after the return of the Jews from exile, and the Jerusalem temple worship is about to begin. This is the book of Nehemiah, chapter 8, verses 1 to 12. By the 7th month, the Israelites were all settled in their towns. On the first of that month, they all gathered in the square by the water gate in Jerusalem. Ezra was a priest, a scholar of the law, which Yahweh had given by Moses to Israel, which they asked Ezra to get. He brought the book to the gathering, which consisted of men, women, and such children as were old enough to understand. In that square by the gate, he read the law to them until noon, and they listened carefully as he stood on the wooden platform that had been erected for the occasion. As Ezra stood there above the assembly, their eyes were fixed on him, and he opened the book. They all immediately stood up, and Ezra said, "Yahweh, the great God, be praised." And everyone lifted their arms and said, "Amen, Amen," and then knelt down with their faces to the ground. Then they stood up in their places, and as Ezra read, the Levites translated it into Aramaic so the people could understand it. When the people heard what was required of them by the law, they were embarrassed and they wept. Nehemiah, the governor, Ezra, the priest, the expert in the law, and the Levites who were translating it, calmed them down, saying, "Don't mourn or cry today. This is a day that is sacred to Yahweh your God. Go home now and make a feast, and share your food and wine with those who haven't enough. It's a festival for Yahweh. Don't be sad. Let the joy which Yahweh is giving you make you strong." The people did so because they now understood what had been read to them. This book, which Ezra had brought back from exile, is our old friend, the book of Deuteronomy, which had been studied, extended, and polished during the exile. Nostalgia and a longing for knowledge of their past, had been the first motives of the scholars. But as time passed, and the hope of a future for the descendants of Israel had grown, so its importance for the future cohesion of the people also grew. It contained blessings for the obedient, but also curses and blame for those who neglected its precepts. Hence the people's embarrassment. During the exile, the offerings of the temple had ceased, and the festivals had been impossible to keep, because the people had to concentrate on not upsetting their captors and on basic survival. Now they were back in Jerusalem, and they were invited to assemble by the water gate. Ezra, accompanied by a group of fellow Levites, stood up on the hastily constructed platform, and the people were eager to hear what was read. Their posture and their acclamation as the scroll was unrolled find echoes later in Christian worship, particularly when we stand and acclaim the gospel at the Eucharist. Simultaneous translation was made from Hebrew into the Aramaic used by the people, by Levites dotted about among the crowd, who, though at first enthusiastic, became increasingly alarmed at the scale of their failure. In Ezra's mind, this assembly he had called was to be a joyful reaffirmation of the Jewish identity, a renewal of the ancient covenant, and a call to the people to embrace the law and the ancient customs. But it looked increasingly like a fiasco as the people bewailed their failings. So those who had been reading and translating, and even the civil governor, quickly turned the mourning into a feast by telling the people to go home and celebrate God's gift to his people. To a Christian's mind, the quick U-turn that had to be made is no surprise. Of course the people needed to be calmed and cheered up. St. Paul in early Christian times was to make the point that where there's no law, there's no breaking of the law. Some of the returned exiles had lived without the law all their lives. Now, suddenly, in one morning, their lives have been turned into shame and fear. This could only lead to people becoming very law-bound in future generations, which led to untold conflict and to the crucifixion of Christ, who insisted that God is not to be feared but thanked for his forgiveness and for his authentic law, which is to love God and to love one another. So the story of old Israel has matured. And tomorrow we begin a new series of studies. We shall look for the next few weeks at some of the contents of the laws that old Israel tried to obey, starting tomorrow with the human side of the Ten Commandments. And I'll see you then.